A very good afternoon, distinguished guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ankush and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Asia Foundation, Washington DC, and the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, I welcome you to the joint panel discussion titled United States-India Relations in a Turbulent World. To start the proceedings, I would like to invite Mr. John Brandon, Senior Director, International Relations Programs, the Asia Foundation, to deliver the opening remarks. Mr. Brandon, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for the Asia Foundations to be co-hosting today's panel discussion on U.S.-India relations in a turbulent world. I want to thank in particular the Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore, and particularly Dr. C. Raja Mohan, the director of the Institute, along with his associates Ankush J. Wagel and George Mohan. To say that things in Washington are a bit unorthodox is somewhat of an understatement. Our panel discussion comes at a time when U.S.-India bilateral trade is on the rise, but yet trade sentiment is down. While the concept of a free and open Pacific has the potential to be a useful and helpful framework, this policy is viewed as perhaps maybe not being clearly articulated. And this has raised questions in New Delhi and here in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And moreover, U.S. policy towards Afghanistan has a tremendous bearing on U.S.-India relations and stability and security in South Asia as well as globally. U.S. and India are the two world's largest democracies. Both the U.S. and India want a world that respects international law, freedom of navigation and overflight, and sustainable development. And increasingly, ties between the U.S. and India in the areas of higher education and healthcare and the arts are increasing. Before turning the floor over to Dr. Mohan, I'd like to provide a thumbnail sketch of the Asia Foundation, a little bit about our programs, as we don't have a physical presence here in Singapore. The Asia Foundation was founded in 1954. We're 65 years old. We're headquartered in San Francisco and with an office in Washington, D.C., where I'm based. But the thrust of our work in Asia is in our 18 field offices. Our offices are in all three subregions of Asia, and our programs span from Japan to Afghanistan. Broadly speaking, we work in 5 thematic areas. One is to promote good governance predicated on rule of law and civil society strengthening. The second area is women's empowerment, where we work with women to be able to articulate their needs, their desires, their discontent, to provide for their security and their economic empowerment. The third area is economic reform, and much of that working with institutions both in and outside of government that enable small and medium-sized enterprises to flourish. We also work in the area of environmental resilience, and those programs span from enabling villagers to test the quality of their water in places like Laos and Mongolia, to environmental education for junior high and high school students in Vietnam. And the last part is international relations, regional cooperation, part of the Foundation's program portfolio, which I manage. The top program for the international relations program is every 4 years we have a project called Asian Views on America's Role in Asia. We feel it builds to our comparative advantage given our network in Asia to have distinguished voices both in and outside of government, as well as people who are established figures, as well as emerging leaders, to talk about how they view U.S. foreign policy and to enable we share these views with U.S. policymakers in Washington, and but we also share the report elsewhere throughout the Asia Pacific. And I'm pleased that Dr. Mohan was the chair of our project, the South Asian chair of our project in both 2008 and 2016. So thank you, Raja. As I mentioned, we have 18 offices. One of our offices is in India. It's in New Delhi, and our programming there supports local initiatives to enhance women's safety, security, and economic empowerment, as well as initiatives that facilitate India's engagement in regional and global affairs. In late January, the Foundation, along with the Bureau of Research on Industry and Economic Fundamentals, launched a report in New Delhi titled "The Political Economy of Rice Trade Between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal." The report identifies key institutional practices of rice trade between India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, and examines the political economy motives that drive this rice trade. We also promote training for Indian diplomats to gain a nuanced perspective on U.S. foreign policy and its domestic determinants. We do this through a formal two-week seminar in Washington, D.C., and we complement that with a study tour that takes diplomats throughout the United States so they can learn about what other people in the U.S. outside of Washington think about U.S.-India relations. We once had an office in Singapore. We were here in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and our program focused on leadership development, education, and Singapore's regional relations. While we no longer have an office, the Foundation still cooperates with leading Singapore institutions on a range of regional issues and programs. We work with the Technical Cooperation Directorate in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in support of study tours and training for other Asian countries, and to learn from Singapore's development experience and technical expertise. We also have collaborated with the Lee Kuan Yew School at NUS for specialized training for emerging Asian leaders. We have placed loose scholars in various institutions here in Singapore, and with the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, we held a conference last year on legal issues of regional importance in U.S.-ASEAN relations. And now we're very pleased to be able to be working with the Institute of South Asian Studies on this program today, and hopefully others in the future. So now let me stop there, and let me turn the floor over to Dr. Mohan and our speakers this afternoon. And again, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon. We will now proceed with the panel discussion. I would like to invite on stage the distinguished panel of speakers, Mr. Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia, Wilson Center, Washington, D.C., Dr. Rani Mullen, Visiting Senior Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, Dr. Tanvi Madan, Director, the India Project, and Fellow, Foreign Policy, Project on International Order and Strategy, Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C., Mr. Aman Thakker, Research Associate, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C., and Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economic Policy, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. The session will be moderated by Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. I now hand over to Professor Mohan.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this session on US-India relations in a turbulent world. I really want to start by thanking Mr. John Brandon for agreeing to work with us. Though I've known John for a long time, we worked with them in various other capacities, but this is really the first time the Institute of South Asian Studies is working with the Asia Foundation. As you know, that Asia Foundation has been very much part of America's post-war engagement with Asia, and has contributed enormously to promote understanding of Asia in the US and of the US in Asia. For us, I think the partnership is of special value because sitting in Singapore, the South Asian Studies Institute, one of our primary tasks is to step up our engagement with Southeast Asia. That it's part of a mandate that how do you link, promote greater cooperation between South and Southeast Asia So we hope we can take advantage of Asia Foundation's vast presence in Southeast Asia as we look ahead and to see what are the kind of things that we can do between ISAS and the Asia Foundation. Now, for us, for me, it's a special pleasure also to welcome so many friends from Washington, as well as two of my colleagues, Rani Mullen and Amitendu Palit. You see, I mean, we have three very different centers are represented here: the Brookings, CSIS, and the Wilson Center. One of the things we wanted to do with this project was really to get a sense of what's happening in the United States. Too often, we tend to focus very narrowly on bilateral issues, while the conference is focused on bilateral issues. We would like to see the turbulence. Large part of it comes from because America has become a variable, because America's domestic politics have become unpredictable. Therefore, the nature of our US-India relationship depends to a large extent on what happens inside the United States. So we really look forward to hearing from our friends. So we have actually, out of the 5 speakers here, 3 distinct set of issues. At the far end is Aman and Michael are going to talk about trade issues. It's been a major source of friction between India and the US. Rani and Michael are going to talk about Pakistan, Afghanistan, which is now, given the peace process that is unfolding and the kind of issues that it is generating, is going to be of great interest to all of us, those who study South Asia and even those who don't. Finally, we have Tanvi Madan, who can actually single-handedly deal with both Indo-Pacific as well as coordinated issues. So I think we cover quite a nice spectrum of issues. So what we're going to do is to have each one of them speak for about 7 minutes in the opening remarks. Then maybe we'll have 1 or 2 rounds of questions on the podium, and then we'll open it up for question and answers from the floor. So we're going to start with Michael, to start with Afghanistan, Pakistan related issues, followed by Rani. Then we have Tanvi, and then we'll end up with the discussion on trade related issues. So please give a big hand to our panelists.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to thank Roger Mohan and John Brandon for inviting me to this discussion. Look forward to it. It's great to be in Singapore. So I will cast my remarks in the broader context of President Trump's South Asia policy. I think it's important to emphasize that U.S.-India relations are playing out not only against the backdrop of a turbulent world, but also a very turbulent region. First consideration to put out there is that the Trump strategy is not a truly comprehensive South Asia policy in a geographic sense. For years, this is not new, for years Washington has framed its South Asia policy through narrowly defined lenses that are country-specific rather than region-specific. And of course, as we know, the Trump administration's focus is on India, but also Pakistan and Afghanistan. The lack of a geographically comprehensive focus is not a surprise, given that U.S. interests in South Asia, which revolve around issues like stability and managing the rise of China, are best served by prioritizing Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And I think another factor that helps explain the lack of a comprehensive geographic focus is that the bureaucracy of U.S. statecraft and foreign policy has long had trouble conceiving of South Asia as a single distinct region. You have 2 military commands that essentially split the region down the middle. CENTCOM oversees Pakistan, Indo-PACOM oversees India. The State Department's Regional Bureau for South Asia also includes Central Asia. The State Department and USAID have both had separate offices focused on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Beyond that, though, there are 3 other elements of Trump's South Asia policy that are not new, and in fact, quite similar to U.S. policy during the second Obama administration. I'll briefly highlight those. First, there is a strong emphasis on Afghanistan that justifies the U.S. presence there on counterterrorism grounds, and focuses not only on dealing with the Taliban, but also the issues of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Second, as we all know, there's a major focus on deepening relations with India. There have been problems on the trade and economic side, and we'll hear about that. But the relationship has moved forward in a big way. I don't need to dwell on that. And I think that the one could argue that the trade and the economic aspects of the U.S.-India relationship may constitute an Achilles heel of sorts, but the defense side is really the sweet spot. I would argue that the U.S. relationship with India may be one of the only U.S. bilateral relationships with a key partner that has actually moved forward in the Trump era. Israel, the U.S. relationship with Israel, may be one of the only others. A third reason why Trump's South Asia policy is not new is that there is a harder line on Pakistan that has been expressed in words, but not in action. I think this is important. There's a tendency to think that Trump is taking a harder line on Pakistan. He said some tough things, but actually, I'm not sure I'd agree with that. When Trump outlined his South Asia strategy in a speech in August 2017, he indicated that the U.S.-Pakistan partnership cannot survive so long as Pakistan shelters the terrorists that Washington is fighting in Afghanistan. And he vowed to take a new approach. That's what he said in his speech. But you could argue that not that much has changed at the end of the day. The U.S. has not turned on Pakistan. Certainly it's taken a few punitive steps, like cutting off all security assistance to Pakistan, but this is something that's been done before. There's nothing new about that. The Trump administration, despite all the bluster, has really refrained from tightening the screws on Pakistan. And that is because, quite frankly, it has its hands tied. And it has its hands tied because of Afghanistan. I think that the U.S. in recent decades has tended to view Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan. Whether that's right or wrong, that's how it's been. The U.S. does not want to do anything too drastic in its relationship with Pakistan that could cause Pakistan to invoke one of its only tools of leverage that can be deployed against the United States, and that is to shut down these NATO supply lines on its soil. The U.S. also does not want to prompt Pakistan to scale back the cooperation that it has been receiving from Pakistan in Washington's current talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that brings me to the fact that there are a few very new things about Trump's South Asia policy. And I'll briefly highlight them and then wrap up. One, as we all know, Taliban negotiations have been elevated to a top priority for the administration. I think that the biggest goal in U.S. South Asia policy right now is getting a deal with the Taliban. And this is because Trump wants to leave, even more than Obama wanted to leave. Obama never wanted to stay in Afghanistan either. Why does Trump want to leave? He wants to leave in part because he knows, or at least he believes, that his political base wants to leave Afghanistan. And of course, there's almost an election year coming in the United States. Second thing that's new about the Trump South Asia policy is that the United States has asked India to do more in Afghanistan. This has understandably caused some friction, though I would argue, we could discuss more about this later, that in my view, by asking for India to do more in Afghanistan, Trump means this as a compliment. In effect, he's saying, we like what you're doing in Afghanistan, and we want you to do more of it. Third thing that's new in the Trump South Asia policy is a U.S. willingness on some occasions to align itself more closely with India in the India-Pakistan dispute. So in the recent India-Pakistan crisis, John Bolton essentially told his counterpart, Ajit Doval, that the U.S. supports India's right to self-defense, effectively endorsing India's decision to stage airstrikes in Pakistan after the Jaish-e-Mohammed attack in Kashmir. Those are pretty strong words coming from Bolton, notably stronger than those uttered by one of his predecessors, who had been in the Obama administration, Susan Rice, who as NSA made some pretty strong comments after the attack in Uri in 2016, but not as strong as what Bolton said. And I think it's also worth noting in this context that the White House has expressed public opposition to the Belt and Road Initiative because it involves disputed territory. That's what James Mattis said when he testified on Capitol Hill some time ago. Now this dovetails with India's position, which has opposed BRI because the CPEC component of it runs through areas of Pakistan that India claims as its own. Fourth thing that's new is what I would describe as a lack of enthusiasm toward making the relationship with Pakistan work better. I said before there have not been many efforts to take a harder line on Pakistan in a big way, but there also have not been many efforts to try to make things better. There really is not much energy and political will in Washington these days to really invest the time in trying to make the relationship with Pakistan work better. I think the idea and the goal is to get just enough goodwill in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship to allow Pakistan to work with the United States on negotiations, on Taliban negotiations. Final thing that's new about the U.S.-South Asia strategy under Trump is, of course, the man himself, Trump. There are personality factors here that have a major bearing on U.S.-South Asia policy, but I will be happy to wait till our discussion to highlight those factors. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael covered several issues that I was going to raise. It was setting the stage for U.S.-South Asia policy. I do want to pick up, that the South Asia policy has evolved, right? Specifically with regard to Afghanistan. Trump campaigned on bringing boys home, right, ending the Afghan war, but then since coming to office has actually vacillated quite a bit in terms of his policy towards Afghanistan. So initially, the campaign promises gave way to a host of senior advisors who were generals, who had a specific view of Afghanistan, and we find that articulated in the 2017 policy that you talked about. And in that policy, Trump actually came out quite strongly against Pakistan, right? No aid. He talked about Pakistan had, been engaging in lies and deceit. So there was quite a turnaround with regard to Pakistan, and this sense that one had to devote perhaps a bit more resources to Afghanistan. Now we're in a very different situation. 2019, Afghanistan is scheduled to have elections this summer. It's in the U.S., the campaign season is starting to gear up for U.S. elections next year, and Trump realizes his campaign promises might come to haunt him, and so Zalmai Khalilzad, the special representative, has been tasked with bringing a deal, ending the war, at least having some kind of face-saving exit for the U.S. from Afghanistan. India has been watching nervously, I think, especially after these last attacks, Puljama. India, just to sort of recap, Indian engagement in Afghanistan has a long history of engagement. India today is the 5th largest donor of foreign aid. U.S. of course is the largest, but India is the 5th largest just in dollar terms. That's not even taking into account purchasing power parity of what India actually is able to deliver on the ground. India historically has had good relations with Afghanistan and was quite worried about what the fallout from these peace negotiations might be, particularly once the U.S. pulls out. So I think we can see that U.S. and India now might be looking in different directions in terms of their goals, yet there's quite a bit of overlap also. I think both countries do want to ensure that Afghanistan is not going to be a host for any kind of a terrorist group in the future. Both would prefer not to see an Islamic emirate take hold there. And I think there's broadly, the U.S. has invested quite a bit of money in setting up, in defending a democratic system, human rights, a constitution that is committed to human rights, etc. So those are sort of the broad outlines in terms of what the U.S. goal is in wanting to get out. Now, the way in which these peace negotiations, or these talks, really not negotiations, right now it's just the U.S. talking with the Taliban representatives, has these echoes of Vietnam. We know the situation is quite bad. The security situation is the worst since 2001. If you look at, how many districts the Taliban controls and where they have a presence. So the U.S. wants out, is trying to get the Taliban to agree to a minimum set of terms, and the Afghan government, which has for years we've always said, Afghans in the driver's seat, this is a sovereign government, and yet what we see happening now is that the Afghan government has been relegated to the sidelines. In fact, today there was a news story that Afghan special representative kind of backtracked and said, yes, we have been briefed by the US, but maybe not on this last round of talks. So Afghans are being briefed after talks are being held, not perhaps thoroughly and not consistently. And what's also clear is that the US is negotiating for itself. The NATO has an agreement to stay and to support Afghanistan until 2024. NATO troops are based and troops from other supporting countries, and yet that's not on the table. It's the US directly negotiating for themselves and then informing others as they go through these negotiations. And the Taliban is meeting with all kinds of governments, but not with Afghan governments. And in fact, by the US meeting with them consistently over time with the Taliban, in fact, what it's led to is an agreement or sort of giving support to the Taliban statement that the Afghan government is a stooge or is support, is basically not a sovereign government, but is one that is where the US calls the shots. So I think it's important to realize what these dynamics, the US of course clearly wanting to get a deal in order to get out, but the fallout of that to decrease the stature, if you will, of the Afghan government. And what's also clear is that we're now in the 18th year of US troops and NATO troops in Afghanistan. These negotiations have had no red lines. And that makes many countries in the region, including India, quite nervous, right? What's going to happen to human rights? What's going to happen to the whole constitutional system, democratic system? So where will this go, and where does it leave US and India with regard to their views in Afghanistan? One is, as already mentioned by Michael, the US wants India to do more in Afghanistan. And India really, not only India, the bulk of the countries in the region and abroad with strategic interests have been free riding on the US. It's US troops out of it's mostly Afghan citizens, but of the international troops who are dying in Afghanistan, it's largely American troops. And so the fact that India has been quite happy to have the US there, Trump is now saying, okay, it's our troops, it's our money there, others need to step up, including India. But after there was some outcry recently, there's been, and I'd be keen on hearing what the other panelists think, that there's been a little bit of backtracking by Trump saying, where he said, well, we're not going to agree to a bad deal in Afghanistan. So there's some sense that, we don't want to be seen, being the US doesn't want to be seen as repeating a Vietnam-like scenario. And I think the regional politics where the US needs India for its eastward engagement in the Indo-Pacific is also important in terms of they don't want to, Indian interests are important to the US also with regard to Afghanistan because India is so crucial to the US's engagement in the Indo-Pacific.
That brings us to the larger Lucas.
Thank you, Raja, and thank you to ISAS and the Asia Foundation. We're talking a lot about the Indo-Pacific in Washington these days, so it's good to be in the heart of it. One thing I was asked to talk about is kind of where this free and open Indo-Pacific, and you'll forgive me if I'll use the acronym FOIP because it's just easier. It can be quite a tongue twister. But I was asked to talk about kind of where the FOIP strategy or vision or concept fits into the US-India relationship. One of the things we do know about US-India relations over the last kind of 7 decades is the state of the relationship depends very much on the role that each of the countries has assigned for the other in its strategic script. And when President Trump first came to office, there was a lot of concern that not only would India not necessarily have a role, because he was more transactional, but that a strategic script didn't exist, that there was going to be a transactional one. And so what kind of Free and Open Indo-Pacific or FOIP has done is it's reinforced a role for India in the US strategic script, similar to the one that the Bush and the Obama administrations had. And by doing so, FOIP has kind of reiterated or reinforced the strategic rationale for the strategic framing for the relationship. And it also syncs well with the Modi government in India's Act East strategy. Prime Minister Modi, as he said here in Singapore, that India doesn't have an Indo-Pacific strategy, it has an Indo-Pacific vision, and the strategy is the Act East part. So what are some of the synergies between the two? One is the two countries in the region kind of have outlined a key shared objective, which is the idea that the end goal is a free, open, inclusive region. The second is kind of shared principles, some of which are kind of rules-based order, freedom of navigation and overflight, good governance, sustainable development, as well as respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. There's also kind of a shared set of partners, including in South and Southeast Asia, as well as countries like Australia and Japan, and to some extent South Korea. And then there's kind of the shared concern that both countries have, and in various ways, whether explicitly or in India's case, implicitly, the challenge that both have kind of thought of into some of these kind of principles in the Indo-Pacific and to this end goal is China's behavior. And the kind of broader concern, and we can talk about the details of it, but the broader concern about the nature and extent of Chinese involvement and influence in the region. And so there have been concerns both on the strategic, of the defense and the economic side over the last few years. And from India's perspective, this kind of shared concern is potentially helping in this kind of FOIP framing is useful because it's either actually bringing or potentially bringing American resources to bear in the region, whether that's military resources, whether that's economic resources in the context of development financing for connectivity projects or technical expertise. But it's also bringing kind of security assistance, capacity building efforts, and even diplomatic resources which weren't expended in places, particularly in the kind of smaller neighbors that India has in South Asia. So just in the last few months, we've seen both the Nepalese and the Maldivian foreign ministers come to Washington and meet with Secretary Pompeo, something that hadn't really happened for a while. But from Delhi's perspective, what this has also done to the US-India relationship is that because of this concern about China, the Trump administration kind of sees a role, as previous administrations have, though less explicitly, haven't quite said it, but they see a role for India vis-a-vis China in this kind of region of the Indo-Pacific, and in this context, whether it's as a balance, a democratic contrast, or kind of a like-minded partner willing to burden share. And for this administration, that last part is quite important. And what that's done in the last 2 years is that it's fueled cooperation, particularly on the defense and security side of the US-India relationship. And we've seen this in the form of the 2+2 dialogues, or defense and diplomatic dialogue at the ministerial level that's been formed, a lot of high-level exchanges and working-level cooperation, progress on interoperability agreements, technology transfer approvals in the US for India, expanded military exercises, joint capacity building efforts. But we've also seen things like the US-India-Japan trilateral upgraded, and then the revival of the infamous quadrilateral dialogue as well, We've seen, in addition, communication and coordination between the US and India during crises, the Doklam crisis in 2017 between China and India, as well as the recent India-Pakistan crisis. And then we've seen coordination between the US and India in multilateral and regional forums, as well as in third countries. And so this has all kind of come under that FOIP framework. And what it's also done is, in Washington, it's created a voice, it's given Indian perspectives and concerns about the region a voice in a way that it hadn't before. India had tended to be put in a South Asia box, and now it's been seen as an Asian country after a number of years. And what FOIP has also kind of done is, beyond that, beyond giving India a voice, beyond kind of driving actual cooperation, is it's also given the two countries an incentive for the two countries to actually manage differences, and something Rani alluded to, which is it's playing into how the US even thinks about what's happening to India's West, but it's definitely done so in kind of even a broader context. So, for example, the willingness to give India a 6-month sanction waiver on Iran, or kind of potentially exempt it from Russia sanctions for its defense purchases from that country. And then India's relatively muted response to the American withdrawal of trade benefits for India recently under GSP. These are all because of the kind of broader need for each other in this FOIP space. Having said that, just to end, that the FOIP has also, in its own way, been a subject to some difference between the two countries. Both countries have different geographic conceptions of the Indo-Pacific. For India, it includes the Western Indian Ocean region going to the coast of Africa. Whereas for the US, as Admiral Harry Harris infamously said, the Indo-Pacific runs from Hollywood to Bollywood. And so there is that kind of missing gap in the middle. There's also different areas of emphasis and priority. Indian officials will often say, listen, for the US, the Indo-Pacific is a maritime concept, or we have problems that are continental too, including things like the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which span both maritime and continental. American officials will say that for them, the technological domain is becoming increasingly competitive. The Huawei issue, for example, whereas India is still not as much not as concerned about it as the US is. They also have different ideas of who their partners, what their partnership should look like in the Indo-Pacific. For India, Russia is part of its Indo-Pacific vision and strategy. It sees it as part of the solution to the problem in the Indo-Pacific. Many in the US see Russia as part of the problem. You also kind of have this kind of broader sense that when it comes to some of these FOIP principles that are shared, each country kind of sees the other as falling short. This is nowhere kind of seen more clearly than in the economic arena. The US thinks that India is neither that open nor that free when it comes to trade and investment policy, for example. India sees the US as a disruptor of the trade system, or the rules-based order on the trade side, with TPP replaced by a unilateral approach that involves tariffs that are targeting not just China, but India as well. And India also sees kind of the US becoming less free and less open when it comes to things like immigration policy, which India sees as a trade policy. And then finally, kind of the concern that FOIP is actually bringing to the fore as well is that there still persists a kind of general uncertainty on two fronts. One is uncertainty with regard to the other's commitment. So for India, is President Trump really committed to this approach, or is it just the approach that some administration officials are taking? For both countries, they are questioning whether the other is committed to the China approach that they're currently taking. Is it sustainable? Will it last? And then finally, uncertainty over capabilities. Is India able to burden share? Has it built the military, economic, bureaucratic capacity and capability to do what it's saying, and the US wants it to, but what it says that it will do? And for the US, is the US going to deploy the capabilities that it has in the region, particularly in the context of the debate in the US about retrenchment versus rebalancing? And whether or not and how, whether this FOIP will be a driver of the US-India relationship or a disruptor will really depend on how some of these differences, some of these uncertainties are resolved, or at the very least, alleviated.
neither free nor open. President Trump talks about fair trade these days. Indians have never been under free trading nations. So, Aman, you want to?
Thank you, Dr. Raja Mohan, and thank you, John, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here in Singapore. So talking about U.S.-India trade, one of the key aspects and the themes that I wanted to focus on was beyond just thinking about the U.S.-India strategic partnership. Why does U.S.-India trade matter? What is the deeper instinct there? What is the deeper sort of meaning there for U.S.-India trade relations? And increasingly, when looking at the broader issue of U.S.-India trade, you see that outside of Washington and outside of New Delhi, you see a growing interdependence and growing sort of focus on trade as being driving jobs, growth, and prosperity in both countries. And while the capitals may forget that, cities and states outside of both Washington and New Delhi do tend to keep that in mind. And that's sort of the theme that I'll focus on in my discussion here. If you look at growth in U.S.-India trade, you see it completely balloon from 20 years ago at 16 billion. And to give you a sense of what that is like, 16 billion was about, if you add up the net worth of all 5 billionaires in Kazakhstan, that's about it. That was what U.S.-India trade was 20 years ago. And that's grown eightfold in the last 20 years to about 126 billion. But if you go beyond just those numbers, you look at that growth as really a physical economic manifestation of the recognition of mutually held values and then the convergence of that strategic partnership and strategic interests that the United States and India are increasingly recognizing and talking about, especially as it comes to the free and open Indo-Pacific that Tanvi was discussing. But let me click in a little bit deeper there on what I mean in terms of that dependence on growth, prosperity, and jobs. If you look at the U.S. states where the jobs are maximum, where Indian companies are hiring the most amount of American citizens, you see plenty of states that voted for Trump. You see Florida, Texas, Nevada, Georgia, hitting well above 5,000 jobs in those states that depend on Indian companies hiring them. And same thing in America. You've got 2,000 companies hiring close to 1 million people in India. And I think that again speaks to just how much U.S. and India are depending on each other for trade. And this is specifically on export-dependent companies that sort of look to U.S. and India and say, this is where if something should rock the boat there, we'll lose those jobs, we'll lose that amount of prosperity, and we'll lose that growth. Let me sort of say a story that I found while doing some research on GSP here. This is trying to find voices in Trump country that tend to speak about India. I found a pretty interesting story in Ankeny, Iowa, where an agriculture company called Albaugh was talking about India, where they said, if trade relations with India are further impacted, I'll quote here, this will greatly impact Albaugh's business, which employs approximately 300 people throughout the United States, and its ability to offer such opportunities for savings to the American farmers. India supports U.S. jobs and helps keep Albaugh and other American companies competitive. That's really from the heart of Trump country talking about the importance of why U.S.-India trade matters. Similarly, you've seen voices in India right after Finance Minister Arun Jaitley raised custom duties on about 50 product lines in the February budget in 2018, sort of saying, if you have to pay more for these items, our users will pay more, and if they cannot buy them, we will have to hold back on developing our strategies and our future growth. That's, again, voices within India just underscoring why trade with the United States is really particularly important. Now, I'll be honest here and say there are steps that both countries have taken. Both sides have their warts. Protection steps by President Trump's administrations on steel and aluminum, putting India on the currency manipulation watch list, and most recently the intent to revoke India's GSP benefits. But India's also has its own share of warts here. Taking 50 product lines custom duty increases in February of 2018, followed up by another 19 in September. followed by local content rules and price controls. Really, even the finance minister saying in his budget speech that he is reversing 20 years of economic and trade policy that India had been following. So, there are these warts, but I think when you look at outside again of those capitals, it's really great to see that U.S.-India exports, and I think John mentioned this, they've been growing so much, 28.9% growth in U.S. exports to India, 11.9% growth of Indian exports to the U.S. One of the really great stories of economic trade in real numbers. Speaking of, last time I was in Mumbai, people were talking, I don't understand why both of these capitals are slinging mud at each other. Companies are making money, and then there's actually business happening. And I think the big recommendation here is, in as much as these warts and these protection steps have driven trade policy for this part, we really need to make sure we don't rock the boat anymore. We really, really need to make sure that this is not something that continues to happen. The last thing that I'll mention is on the China factor. And I come up with a brief exercise here of how much China is a factor on both countries' protection steps. And really you can see that both countries, their protection steps being driven by China, actually are getting each other caught in the crossfire. And if we can, as Tanvi was saying, ensure deeper coordination and communication, even on the economic and trade policy front, we can find ways where this is of strategic interest. Finding that, as a percentage, both India and China see, a massive percentage of the trade deficit, with China ballooning. For India, it grew at 23% last year, making up about 39% of the entire trade deficit, and with the United States, even higher at 47%. But India, which is where you sort of see President Trump's desire to really reduce the trade deficit, India only makes up about 2.3% of the U.S. trade deficit. And really, by driving sort of our trade protectionist policies when the action should be on China, we're sort of getting the U.S.-India economic relationship caught in the crossfire because there isn't that level of strategic discussion and conversation as it's happening on the security front. So, really the last thing that I can sort of say in reading U.S.-India trade policy, finding them, how they manifest outside of the Beltway and outside of the National Capital Region in Delhi, is really to say that we need to be guided not by a physical number on the trade deficit. We need to be guided by two things. One is the real trade numbers and the voices, such as the one in Iowa and others in El Paso, Texas, manufacturing companies talking about their dependence on India. Let those be the guiding voices about how we should move trade policy forward between the United States and India. But also finally, rooting the U.S.-India trade relationship in both of our strategic interests. In the fact that China is really the driving factor here on the massive ballooning of trade deficit for both countries, and making sure that actions that we take that are driven by making sure that we don't continue to lose out to China and its unfair trade practices, we're not getting each other in the crossfire. And I think by focusing on the way that we can strategically communicate, on deepening our coordination between key agencies, and by keeping this sort of target in mind about the voices outside of the Beltway that really depend on jobs, growth, and prosperity on U.S.-India trade, and making sure that our strategic interests are aligned, that's, I think, the way forward in making sure that we don't actually continue down the path that we're on right now, where we've kind of been slinging mud at each other and keeping the U.S.-India trade relationship from moving forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Lovely to see friends, old friends. Panellists, thank you, Professor Mohan, for this opportunity. Let me just, since I had the great opportunity of being the last speaker on the panel, let me just go back to the subject, the United States-India relations in a turbulent world. Now, I think today's world is a world where words have come to be described in a somewhat different fashion. Disruption is not necessarily negative in today's world. Disruption is mostly positive. I guess a similar connotation can be drawn with respect to turbulence as well. And when I look at the US-India trade relations, I think there is a certain degree of the upside when one looks at this turbulence. And let me explain what I'm trying to say. In March 2018, a series of announcements began coming out of the US, which actually fundamentally changed the global conversation on trade. And the first of these announcements was the unilateral tariffs on steel and aluminum imports into the US. Thereafter, there were a series of further announcements. But in pursuant to the first series of announcements on steel and aluminum tariffs, several countries retaliated. And one of the countries which said it would retaliate was India. Interestingly, India announced counter tariffs on $240 million of US exports into India. Those tariffs were supposed to have been effected on the 4th of August 2018. Since then, they haven't been effected. What is the reason for that? The reason is that that announcement was followed by a series of very intensive bilateral negotiations between the US and India on trying to see if the situation actually presents an opportunity to sort out issues between the two sides, which were actually never discussed in the field of trade. So what I mean to say is that this was a period when the rest of the world, including the trade order, was in turbulence. US-China trade relations were at best uncertain, heading towards a direction from which there has yet not been a recovery, though there are signs of recovery. The US was engaged in very intense negotiations with Mexico and Canada on redrafting of the NAFTA. It was taking the opportunity to have put in motion tariff escalations to sort out trade bilaterally with Argentina and Japan. And at the same time, it took up the issue with India as well. Now, I don't think this is ad hoc. There is a pattern to this. The US actually utilized unilateral actions to go where a moribund WTO was not capable of going. It was trying to create for itself a very different pattern of access in major markets. It was trying to bring in the security issue as a paradigm for deciding trade relations, and it included India with its catalyst. Now think about this. A US-India trade deal, what does that mean? Among all the partners with whom the US has FTAs, the largest of these are either Canada or Mexico, either Canada or Korea. They're pretty much close to each other in terms of the size of the economies, but unfortunately from a US perspective, none of the two are very exciting economies. In terms of economies who in future are going to be among the biggest contributors of global growth. And if you look at the other economies which are in the top 10, a US-China deal, well, might happen, might not happen. US was able to successfully persuade Japan to actually come to bilateral trade talks, and those have started. With EU, the talks collapsed. With Germany, separately not possible. Brazil, different world. That leaves India. And a US-India trade deal brings the world's topmost, and today, the 6th largest economy together. So it might not be a trade deal in conventional terms, but it would have been a deal, and it can still be a deal which is huge, large, with enormous possibility. So when these talks went on, let's not assume that it was only happening between the governments of the US. There was a certain amount of business lobbying that went into the backing of these talks. There was a company, an American company, which is one of the largest players in the retail space in India today, which submitted one of the most forceful petitions urging the US to not withdraw GSP benefits from India when the country review on GSP began in last April. It continued for some time. It is no wonder today that India was the largest beneficiary of the GSP program in the US, but that's not the point. India cannot hope to have the GSP continued for a large number of reasons. So that's be it. But what is important today is that from the time the talks began, from the time businesses started lobbying for it, certain changes happened in India. And these changes acted in a fashion which went against the very interest that the US were trying to achieve and pursue through the trade deal. And let me allude to one fact. We know that trade deficits have been the parameter on the basis of which the US has been working to correct trade relations. Now, India is an example of a country where it enjoys, however small, a surplus with the US on both the manufacturing and the services accounts. This is interesting because with China, Japan, and all other countries, US runs manufacturing deficits, it doesn't run service deficits. And the opportunity that the US had, still has, in getting into the Indian market and in technology and services related areas are the areas where it has a very strong chance of turning around this deficit. But you can't see it happening if India changes its e-commerce policy in a fashion which doesn't give the US companies the level playing field it wants, if it changes in data laws in a fashion when the economy, which is lined up to be the largest generator of commercial data in the world, forces it to stay localized. So all these things today have brought the talks to a stage where turbulence appears to be going on the downside, not on the upside. And what is the reason for that? The reason, again, is a very peculiar mindset. I think there's no surprise in the fact that the US does not treat security and trade as exclusive matters. It treats them in an integrated fashion. All the US FTAs have happened with countries which are security, defense, or alliance partners with the US, and clearly the US looks at India as an important defense and strategic partner, is happy to get into a bilateral trade relationship which is far above, upgraded, and wider than what it right now is. Unfortunately, India doesn't think that way. India completely disconnects security geopolitics with trade. It is not happy with the WTO, but it is not prepared to give up on the WTO. So it locks on somewhere without knowing why it is locking on there. And on the other hand, it is also not prepared to take the step forward, knowing fully well that there is no alternative to taking the step forward. So what you now encounter is a very peculiar situation where everything remains in suspended animation. Till at least the elections in India are over, because the great opportunity that was there seems to have not gone away, but seems to have been deferred for the time being, because I am personally not prepared to believe that something as trivial as capping the prices of medical stents manufactured by the US to be sold in India were actually the trigger for the US denying India the GSP benefits. The story was much bigger than that, and we need to come down to further fundamental changes in the Indian policy spectrum and domain, which has actually locked this opportunity down. So let's wait and see whether there could be more turbulence and more hope. Thank you.